In the Middle Ages, winter was basically nature's way of saying to people, "All right then, let us see how you handle this." Those warm stone castles, sheltered rooms, and cozy scenes by the fireplace that we see in stories today were, in reality, a pretty embellished version of things. Especially for peasants, winter was almost a non-stop survival test. You had to wake up before the sun even rose, and the house you were in could feel colder than the outside. When you opened your eyes to a morning like that, it was clear from the very first minute that the day would not be easy. Today, when the heating bill goes up or the thermostat drops a little, we complain. But in medieval Europe, the situation was much harsher. According to historical records, winter temperatures in places like England and northern France could sometimes fall to 0 Fahrenheit, which is about -18 degrees Celsius. It was so cold that even the moisture in the ground could freeze and glue your boots to the earth. And this was not nearly as rare as people might think. Daily life began before sunrise. Peasants got up from their frozen beds, took care of the animals, and handled the first tasks of the morning. One medieval writer noted that peasants sometimes woke up with frost on their eyebrows. Just imagining it makes you feel cold inside. You can feel the chill on your face before you are even fully awake. Sleeping arrangements were nothing like the beds we have today. Back then, a bed was usually nothing more than a pile of straw and grass laid on the floor. From the outside, it might not seem very comfortable, but it was actually a rather clever solution. Because these grasses trapped air pockets inside, they provided natural insulation. Archaeological studies show that these beds could sometimes be as thick as 60 centimeters. So there was a serious distance between you and the ground. Peasants collected fresh grass throughout the summer and set it aside specially for winter. They spread it in thick layers on the bed, so they would not come into direct contact with the cold ground. This mattered because in most peasant homes, the floor would turn into something like a small freezer during winter. But these beds had another side as well. They had to be shaken out every morning, because mice, insects, or other unwelcome guests might have settled into them overnight. In one medieval text, it is told that a peasant's chicken laid an egg in the bed while the peasant was sleeping. Breakfast really did come to bed. The real strength of these grass beds was their natural insulating power. When compressed, they trapped air and made it harder for heat to escape into the ground. Peasants would sometimes add old clothes, worn-out blankets, and even dried moss on top of them. On especially cold nights, they would fluff the bed up even more. Because over time, the packed grass lost its insulating ability. That is why they had to rotate their supply of grass over time. But the hard part was not just the cold. Moisture was a major problem too. Grass beds absorbed dampness and could eventually develop mold. If you had allergies, too bad. There were no modern solutions for that back then. In fact, one historical account says that a nobleman spent a night in a peasant house and kept sneezing because of the grass bed, thinking his nose would fall off. Grass beds were not only used for sleeping, they were also used for sitting during the day. When guests came over, everyone would sit on these piles. Think of them as today's sofas, but more primitive, simpler, and a little more pungent. Wool was another winter essential. For medieval people, wool was almost like survival gear. Peasants relied on it heavily and dressed in layers. Historians say that a single family could own up to 20 pounds of wool garments in total. That is about the weight of a small child. But this child keeps you warm and occasionally makes you itch. Getting wool, though, was no easy job. Every spring, shepherds sheared the sheep, and peasants bought or traded for raw wool. But the real work began after that. Wool was not worn right away like it is today. It had to be cleaned, combed, and spun into thread. We are talking about hours of work. For anyone who thinks washing clothes is hard, it was a pretty instructive process. One interesting feature of medieval wool was that it still contained lanolin. Lanolin is the sheep's natural oil, and it makes the fabric more water-resistant. You might smell a bit like a wet sheep in the rain, but at least the water ran off you more easily. Some peasants noticed that leaving extra lanolin in the wool helped them stay dry. Of course, that would not have won them any medieval fashion contests, but it gave them a major advantage in winter. Wool garments were rarely washed. There was a very good reason for that. Wet wool could turn a person into a block of ice in freezing weather. One medieval record tells of a peasant who washed his wool coat in winter, and then had the coat freeze so hard it could stand upright. After that, people in the village teased him for years. But wool was not perfect. Fleas were an inseparable part of it. That is why people would hang their clothes near the smoke of the fire, hoping the smoke would drive away these little unwanted visitors. The result? A very medieval smell of sheep, smoke, and campfire. Wool's greatest strength showed itself during harsh winter storms. Modern tests show that even when wet, wool still provides good insulation and retains much of its thermal performance. Peasants did not need a laboratory to understand this. They knew it from experience. People moving through snowstorms wrapped in layers of wool looked, from a distance, like walking bundles of straw. But one wool garment was usually not enough. In the medieval world, the winter fashion rule was simple. If you could still move your arms comfortably, you had not put on enough layers. Peasants learned to dress in layers well. Archaeological findings show that on the coldest days, an average peasant wore 4 to 7 layers of clothing. That made them look as if they had thrown every piece of laundry rope in the village onto themselves. To break down this clothing system a bit, first came a long linen shirt reaching down to the knees, then a wool tunic over it, then another wool tunic, followed by a sleeveless jacket called a jerkin, and if they were lucky, a fur-lined cloak. All of this was usually held together with a rope belt. That was not for fashion, but to keep the layers in place. Getting dressed was a job in itself. In one account, a peasant so tangled in his layers was said to have been rescued by his wife, who rolled him across the room like a barrel. In truth, this many-layered system made sense. Modern science confirms it. Thin layers trap warm air better than one thick layer. Peasants learned this through trial and error. Probably through a lot of mistakes and a lot of frozen fingers. But the real problem began when nature called. With that many layers, even going to the toilet was its own adventure. Some records from the period say people preferred to drink less water in winter, just to avoid the hassle of taking all those clothes off and putting them back on. That shows how much they valued staying warm. Children had it hardest of all. Parents wrapped them in so many layers that they walked around like tiny drunken penguins. One medieval writer jokingly said that in winter, you could recognize children on the village hills as rolling round bundles, because they could not even bend their knees properly. Despite all those layers, peasants still needed fire to stay warm. But this fire was not like the fireplaces we know today. In medieval homes, the system was often just a simple fire pit burning in the center of the room. Smoke could go wherever it wanted. Chimneys were not yet widespread, so houses were often smoky, stinging to the eyes, and filled with a heavy smell of soot. Archaeological excavations suggest that the average medieval house had a fire pit about 3 feet across, and only about 15% of the heat stayed in the room. The rest escaped upward through roof openings that were supposed to let the smoke out but often let the snow in too. Finding coal, finding wood, keeping the fire alive, all of that was a problem in itself. Nice dry wood? That was more of a rich person's thing. Peasants burned whatever they could get their hands on, old furniture, broken tools, even a neighbor's mysteriously vanished fence. In one English village record, a group of peasants is said to have stripped apart an abandoned barn and burned it piece by piece during a particularly harsh winter. The local lord was not very pleased, but there was not much else to do in winter. Relighting the fire every morning was another struggle. They tried to keep a coal ember alive through the night. If you lost that ember, you had to walk out into the freezing cold to ask a neighbor for fire. In one medieval story, a man used a hollowed-out turnip to carry a red-hot coal taken from the fire. He ran so fast that people thought demons were chasing him. Smoke was both a curse and a blessing. It burned the eyes and made life harder, but it also kept insects away and protected the wood. Some medieval timbers that have survived to the present day were preserved thanks to the soot layers that built up over the years. You would not recommend that in a home improvement guide today, but back then it was quite a functional method. Every family had its own way of managing the fire. Some stayed awake in shifts throughout the night, while others buried the embers properly so the fire could survive until morning. Some even believed that whispering while adding fuel made the fire burn better. Maybe the smoke made them a bit dazed, who knows? Then there was the matter of food. One of the things that warmed medieval peasants from the inside was dinner. But these were not rich banquet tables. Winter meals were prepared with a "whatever is in the pot" mentality. Research shows that an average peasant family relied on only 7 to 8 basic ingredients throughout the winter. Most of them were root vegetables that looked as if they had grown in a dragon's garden. Turnips, wild carrots, and the thing called neep, which sounds more like the name of a disease, were the main staples of the table. Cooking itself was very simple. Everything was thrown into a pot, water was added, and people waited for it to become something edible. That pot hung over the fire all day, and family members would throw in whatever they could find. Historical records show that at times bark, fibrous or mineral additives, and even skin as protein were used. In one account, a family out of desperation is said to have tried cooking their wooden spoons too, allegedly to add flavor to the meal. But these people were also quite skilled at storing food. They saved whatever they could from summer and autumn. Vegetables were kept in sand, meat was salted or smoked if there was any. So much so that some families became so skilled at food preservation that they traded knowledge with their neighbors. Getting the secret to smoking meat in exchange for 3 turnips was considered a perfectly reasonable deal at the time. Wild herbs and plants were important in this kitchen too. Peasants knew very well which plants could be eaten and which ones could save a stew. A wild plant called poor man's pepper was used to add a bit of character to food. One of the hidden heroes of winter cooking was the herbs dried during summer. Bundles of herbs hung from the beams of every house, making the home look like a medieval apothecary. These herbs were used not only for flavor, but also to help with some winter ailments. Of course, considering they lived inside fire smoke all the time, they probably needed all the help they could get. At night, the family would gather around that never-ending pot of stew, gossip about the day, and try not to think too much about what was floating in it. But they were not alone in those warm homes. They had unexpected roommates. According to research, during winter, up to 30% of the living space in medieval homes was shared with animals. Chickens, pigs, sheep, sometimes even cows. When the cold really set in, all of them were brought inside. This arrangement was no accident. Each one produced heat. A cow could give off as much warmth as a small fireplace, around 5,000 BTU per hour. Medieval peasants were not calculating BTUs, but they knew that sleeping near a cow named Bessie would keep their toes safe until morning. Pigs were like portable heaters, chickens were fluffy foot warmers, and sheep were basically walking blankets. Of course, this came with its own problems. Eating dinner while a pig tried to stick its nose into your plate was not exactly easy. Archaeological findings show that many peasant homes had low barriers to keep animals in certain areas. but historical accounts suggest those barriers were not taken very seriously by the animals. The night sounds were a whole other world. Cows mooing, pigs snorting, chickens suddenly making noise in the middle of the night. Medieval peasants probably learned to sleep through noise only because they had no choice. According to one traveling merchant's account, he stayed at a peasant's house and became convinced the rooster had a personal grudge against him, because it crowed right into his ear every time he dozed off. But these animals were not just sources of noise. They also acted as an early warning system against thieves. For anyone trying to sneak past a suspicious goose, that was very bad news. On top of that, the animals' breathing increased the humidity in the room, which made the air feel a few degrees warmer. They did not know it scientifically, but they knew very well that it worked. Some peasants even developed rules for the animals indoors. Chickens were placed where the first morning light reached them, and so they woke everyone up. Larger animals stayed behind the wall, enjoying the warmth from the stone surface. It was basically a medieval apartment setup, just much smellier. Peasants were clever indoors, but once they stepped outside, they also had to arrange their homes smartly against the harsh winter air. The solution was to turn their homes into little fortresses. Think of a typical medieval house, then split it in half and bury the lower part in the ground. That is exactly what they did. This design provided extra insulation and helped keep the heat inside. Archaeological digs show that about 40% of peasant houses in Northern Europe were partially buried in the ground. They were not luxury basement apartments, but they were a very clever solution. A few feet below the ground, the temperature remains more stable, around 50 to 55 Fahrenheit. Modern science calls this geothermal stability. A medieval peasant would probably just call it common sense. They dug about 3 to 4 feet down and built the walls from there, creating a living space that was warmer in winter and cooler in summer. No air conditioning, no climate control, but still a system that worked. The building materials were whatever was on hand: straw, mud, stone, wood. If it could make a wall, it was used. Some more resourceful peasants would take stones from old Roman ruins and use them in their homes. That left behind buildings that were half medieval, half ancient empire. Local lords did not exactly love this recycling project, but when you are freezing, aesthetics come second. The main issue was stopping drafts. Every crack and gap in the house was filled with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal manure. This improvised ceiling material worked surprisingly well. Tests on rebuilt houses show that it could reduce heat loss by up to 60%. It also gave new meaning to the phrase, "This place is a dump." Doors were interesting too. Most peasant houses had only one door, and it usually did not face the prevailing wind. That was not random. It was a small but effective part of medieval engineering. Often, there was a small entry tunnel, like the ones you see in igloos. One medieval storyteller compared it to passing through a dragon's throat. Considering the smell of the animals inside, that was not entirely unfair. Roofs were built in layers too. Branches, straw, branches again, more straw, sometimes even pieces of turf. In some places, peasants allowed grass to grow on top of the roof. They did not do this for looks, but because the roots held everything together. Besides, goats could graze up there if they wanted. In short, the roof was not just a roof, but a small ecosystem. A well-built home was only half the battle against winter. To go outside, peasants needed equipment that would make modern survival experts jealous. And they really did have such a toolkit. Archaeological finds show that the average peasant had 6 to 8 essential winter tools. These were passed down from generation to generation because they were not just tools, but survival itself. The snow shovel was the king of winter tools. But it was different from the shovels we know today. It was made from a single piece of solid wood, with a wide and flat blade. Tests even show that these shovels could carry more snow than modern plastic shovels. With a single shovel, it was possible to lift about 30% more snow. The price of that, of course, was weight. They were quite heavy. Using one was basically medieval CrossFit. Thick socks were worth their weight in gold. In fact, some market records show that a good pair of winter socks could be worth as much as a chicken. These were not ordinary wool socks either. Peasants would weave strips of rabbit fur between layers of wool. In other words, they were making nature's own winter boots. One medieval writer said these socks kept his feet so warm that he was almost worried they would cook. One of the most interesting tools was the snow stick. It was a long staff used to mark paths in deep snow. Peasants placed these sticks along shared roads before major storms. It was a smart move, because getting lost in a medieval snowstorm was like playing the coldest game of hide-and-seek nobody wanted to win. In some villages, these sticks were painted different colors, using natural dyes that resembled fruit juice. In a way, you could call it the world's first medieval GPS system. But the true hero of winter gear was the humble mitten. Not gloves, mittens. Because keeping the fingers together kept them much warmer than separating them. They figured that out centuries ago. And these mittens were not bought from a store. Their insides were stuffed with dried moss, chicken feathers, and sometimes cat fur. Pure recycling culture. The tools had to be ready at all times. Because medieval weather forecasting mostly meant looking up at the sky and hoping for the best. Still, some good predictions could be made by watching animal behavior. If the cows indoors were crowding together unusually closely, a storm was on the way. If pigs were gathering extra straw, cold weather was coming. It was not the Weather Channel, but it often worked. All of this shows how practical and resilient medieval peasants were. From earth-sheltered houses to rooms shared with animals, from constantly simmering stews to fur-lined socks, everything was a solution built for survival. Their resources were limited, but their ability to adapt was extraordinary. In every harsh winter, they stayed standing again and again through their own quiet engineering and their own everyday intelligence.